Thanks. I do have to correct the record about the football stardom. I like to say that half of the passes I caught in high school were for touchdowns, which means I caught 2 passes and for 1 touchdown. And as far as Vanderbilt, I walked on and spent 6 weeks getting knocked around by guys named Bugsy. I decided that my brain was very important to me and left after 6 weeks. But it was fun to at least try to play college football, but it's still SEC football, which I was not equipped for. But Spencer, thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank Skip Rutherford too. Shortly after I moved back to Little Rock in spring of 2007, after being in New York for 20 years, I had lunch with Skip, and if you know Skip's enthusiasm, I told him that I was planning to do this book, and he said, "Oh, when you finish, we're going to have you at the Clinton School." And I thought, well, there's one good reason to finish. I've already got 1 appearance set up, so I'm grateful to Skip's confidence in me. Also, I need to thank Bernie Cox and the staff of the coaching staff from 2007 at Central High, because they were, it took some convincing, and Bernie was admittedly a little wary about letting a journalist into his midst, but once he decided that I could follow the team, he put no restrictions on me at all, and he even said, you know, I know that some things are may happen that I don't like or I don't want you to write about, but you've got to do your job, and I'll trust that you do it well, and as you watch me, you know, us do our job. So that was a great privilege and responsibility. So I wanted to make sure that I got things right, and I also want to thank Nancy and the parents and all the players from that year, because they were most generous with their time and my annoying questions. So I'm really a better writer than I am a speaker, so I won't try your patience too much. But I first have to address the fact that I've written a book about Central High, but I am a graduate of Catholic High. And this might seem like Jon Stewart, you know, writing a book about Glenn Beck, or vice versa, but I like to think more that it's about Jon Stewart maybe writing a book about Stephen Colbert, where there's a kind of friendly enemies or fake enemies, and we're, you know, cut from the same cloth. So, and of course at Catholic High we were always a little envious of Central, because you had something that we desperately desired: girls. But putting aside those conflicts of interest, the first question you might ask is, you know, do we need another book about Central High, and why now? And it's true that the crisis, that many pages have been written about the crisis, and many wonderful books, including memoirs by the Little Rock Nine, Betsy Jakeway's book, and there have been many scholars who've covered that time period, or the period that the crisis brackets, and immediately after it. But my interest is very personal, because I was born in 1957, so the anniversaries of the crisis are as old as I am. And as I began to contemplate my upcoming 50th birthday, I also was hearing, while I was in New York, that planning was going on for the 50th anniversary commemoration. So I was just living in a 400 square foot apartment in Brooklyn and paying way too much money and freelancing, and so I thought this would be a good time to give up that life and to come back home and to see where race relations were in Little Rock today. In being away from so long, the one thing everyone knew about Little Rock, of course, was the Little Rock Nine and the integration crisis. So one of my one of my goals was to tell people something they didn't know, which was about the sweep of Little Rock's history, because I think Little Rock has a fascinating history beyond just the crisis, and an important history. And the fact of my birth in '57 made that an important landmark, but there were many other things about Little Rock that I wanted to explore. And part of that was that I had come of age and grown up in the aftermath of the '57 crisis, but there was still racial tension going on in the early '70s. There was Central was still, or Little Rock was still trying to integration remedies, and there were court cases, and so all of this, I thought the story of the sweep of Little Rock's history, both racial and otherwise, had yet to be told. As far as football came in and how that came into the mix, there were a lot of correspondences that made it seem like a good place to ground the story. First, I'd been a sports writer, so I knew that was an area that I knew really well and felt that I could write about with some authority. Also, my senior year at Catholic High had been Houston Nutt's senior year at Central, and that fantastic team was with Robert Farrell and some of the other players there, was just one of Central's best teams ever. And in deference to my Catholic High teammates, I have to say that we came the closest of anyone that year to beating them. And the last thing that convinced me that this would be an interesting story was that my senior year was Bernie Cox's first year as head coach. And when I returned in 2007, Bernie Cox was still the head coach. And that kind of continuity appealed to me. So I figured he'd seen a lot and he'd done a lot, and I wanted to try and capture that. The other thing that I liked once I met the coaches was that essentially by embedding with the football team, I found that the coaching staff was most interesting to me. It may have been a factor of my age that they were peers rather than the students, but they were such an interesting group of guys. They were, it was black, white, the age range was vast, and they were all crammed into the same office that Clyde Van Sickle, when he took over Central's team in 1936, where he had his office. And I measured it, it's 270 square feet, and there were often as many as 8 coaches in there at a time. And like any workplace, there was a lot of joking, there was a lot of serious discussion, and it was also a vicarious thrill for me, having played football, to be able to be in the coach's office and wonder what they said, when they weren't on the practice field. So all these things I thought would make a great story. The other thing that made the book really personal for me was that when I was growing up in 7th and 8th grade, about all I was interested in was football. And that was the time when Little Rock was experimenting with busing as a remedy for racial imbalance. So 40 years ago this fall, I was in 7th grade at Forest Heights, and there were kids from the east part of town bused over to Forest Heights as well. And about 2 weeks before school started, we were going out for the football team. And I was sharing a football locker with a guy named Ezekiel Vaughn, who went on to become a great player at Central, and who is now a minister in Dallas. But I began to have that dawning realization that Little Rock was 2 cities. And my city, which was the country club pool and movies at the Heights, was completely separate or largely separate from this other city that I really only knew half of the place where I grew up. A similar thing happened the next year when I was the one who was bused across town to Booker, which was a junior high then, and I went out for football 2 weeks before the season started, and got to know some of the African-American kids on the team. So when I went into the classrooms or in the halls, I already had made some friends. And I'll never forget, there was one big lineman who, and soon after classes started, and there were tensions in those days. There were fights in the halls, and some of it was based in racial problems. And this big kid lineman took me aside and said, "Little Jay," because I was probably under 5 feet then. He said, "Little Jay, there's some rogues around here." And I'll never forget how he pronounced rogues, because I was interested in language too, and this wasn't a word I'd really heard before. But he said, "There's some rogues around here, and I want you to know if you ever get in any trouble, you just call on me." And it's only in subsequent years that I thought, what a gift that was that he had given me, that he understood that I was in his territory and that I might need some protection. So this is what football did for me. This was football. My introduction to integration was through these experiences with these kids who didn't look like me, but loved football and were willing to, accept me as friends of theirs. And I think at its best, this is what sports can do for us. So the last part of that experience that I want to mention was that it was also my first experience with call and response. And we were riding over, we would take the bus from Booker over to Scott Field, and we had a really good team that year and won most of the games. So when we were riding back on the bus, some of the kids would start a chant, and I remember just joining in "Who are we? Jaguars. Say it again, Jaguars. One more time, Jaguars." And I thought that this was, we were all these different kids together, but for that bus ride back, we were just all Jaguars. And so football was very important in creating my idea of what integration means. So while it's a book of reportage and research, it's also a very personal book. And I want to I want to read you a quote that really struck home with me when I was doing research for the book. I was reading James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son, and he just spoke so much truth that this one quote of his really struck home with me about, and he wrote it in 1955, so it's 2 years before Central. But he said, "In the context of the Negro problem, neither whites nor blacks, for excellent reasons of their own, have the faintest desire to look back. But I think that the past is all that makes the present coherent, and further, that the past will remain horrible for exactly as long as we refuse to assess it honestly." And I'll also say that when I was growing up in Little Rock, I had a sense that the Central High crisis was something that was an embarrassment to the city, and that it wasn't something that you talked about freely or discussed. So when I read that quote, it hit home with me, because I remember not discussing the crisis and not learning very much about it. in those times, except in, from textbooks. So with that in mind, I also want to, with the idea that the past is what makes the present coherent, I also want to ask by show of hands 2 questions. Who has heard this phrase applied to Central? The most beautiful high school in America. And who has heard the name John Carter? Both these events, or both these phrases, refer to events that happened in 1927. The opening of Central High and the lynching of John Carter, the last lynching that happened in Little Rock. And one thing that obviously intrigued me as a writer was this contrast between what the power structure of Little Rock was doing for the white students, building this magnificent high school, and at the same time, what was happening on the streets of Little Rock, a horrible lynching that's one of the most difficult events in Little Rock's history. But I really didn't hear about the John Carter lynching until a couple of years ago. I know Griff has done some work on that as well, and along those lines. And I stand on the shoulders of people like Griff who've really devoted their lives to this kind of research. But for those of you who don't know, I want to talk a little bit about the lynching. It was the spring of 1927, and I think I've provided in the chapter 2 what is the most complete picture of, or narrative of what actually happened to John Carter. But it was spring of 27. There'd been, the Mississippi River had flooded horribly, and many of you know about that event. And after the flooding, there were a couple of children who were missing. And shortly after the waters had gone down, the body of a girl who was thought lost in the flood was discovered in the belfry of First Presbyterian Church at 8th and Scott. And Lonnie Dixon, who was a 16-year-old son, African-American son of the janitor of the church, was arrested. As soon as word got out that there'd been an arrest, lynch mobs started forming around the town, primarily at City Hall and at the facility called the Walls, the prison, which was south of Little Rock. And the city was basically in chaos. Finally, the sheriff, or the police chief at the time, spirited Lonnie and his father out of town, and they went to many cities across Arkansas trying to escape detection. And finally, the mobs began to disperse after a couple of days. So they brought Lonnie back. He was indicted, and that seemed to satisfy things for a while. A couple of days later, a man named John Carter was on a work detail at the Pulaski County Penal Farm, and he escaped from that detail and ended up assaulting, or allegedly assaulting, 2 women who were driving a cart to town, a horse cart to town. This happened around what's now Shackelford Road and Canis Road. He dove into the woods and started hiding. And finally a posse formed and found him in the woods near about a mile up from Colonel Glenn Road on John Barrow Road. By that time, a lot of other people had heard about this assault, and the mobs were inflamed again. Around 300 people showed up, and because the sheriffs were either afraid or didn't want to confront anything, or just thought it was best to let the mob go, John Carter was hung from a telephone pole, and his body was riddled with some 200 bullets. before he was taken down from the pole. And then what happened next was even more horrible. He was attached to the back of a car and drugged into town and down 9th Street, which was then the black business district, and paraded around town, eventually past City Hall and through the streets until he was deposited. His body was deposited at Broadway and 9th, where it was set on flame. So the Democrat Gazette, or Democrat Gazette, the Gazette at that time described it this way. As thousands converged on the site, they saw the body ablaze, and for 3 hours, when the fire would die down, boxes, limbs, furniture, gasoline, oil, kerosene, and whatever else that could be procured by the mob were thrown upon the charred body of John Carter, while men and women, many with babies in their arms, danced in a circle and howled and jeered. So you can imagine, having read this story, I wondered why I didn't know more about it. It ended when the governor who'd been on a trip to the Strawberry Festival in Van Buren, called out the National Guard, which sounds familiar, and they dispersed the crowd. Despite promise from officials who were in power at that time, no one in the mob was ever charged or indicted for the crime. As you can imagine, this had a chilling effect on what had been a city that had been viewed as a moderate place where African Americans could, make their way. The black press reported that the cars that Missouri Pacific sold 3,000 or 4,000 tickets for trains north out of Little Rock. And people who might have come to Little Rock because of the flood, there were hundreds of refugees, ended up avoiding it like the plague and going to nearby cities like Shreveport and Memphis and St. Louis. So what I think I brought to this story was that and other historians know of this document, but I acquired a copy of it from the Library of Congress. An NAACP investigator visited Little Rock a year after the lynching to see how things were, and he found some people he interviewed said it was even worse, that things were going on that were even worse than the lynching, and that the prospect for African Americans in Little Rock was depressing. Even Scipio Jones, who had so valiantly defended the rights of the Elaine sharecroppers who were railroaded in the aftermath of the Elaine race massacre, that even he, who worked very closely with some of the people in power in Little Rock, felt that the investigator, or warned the investigator against talking to some of the black people in town because he was afraid it might get them in trouble. So at the same time, and only blocks from where John Carter's body was dragged, a magnificent school was rising. It was there's some justification for it being called the most beautiful high school in America. But the other thing that I found out that I think is new that people didn't know was that the phrase, which has been attributed to everybody from the New York Times to the American Institute of Architects, was actually a Chamber of Commerce fabrication. It's been very successful. It's done exactly what the Chamber of Commerce wanted it to do. But there was no award for the most beautiful high school in America. It was printed in the program of the original dedication of the school, and I found a source that said that the city fathers had come up with this great phrase to describe the school. So you know, you won't get any argument from me that it is the most beautiful school, and it's really a magnificent building, and I found out how wonderful it was by researching the construction. It's really amazing. Beyond that, details, let's say past the, well, let me backtrack a little bit. In light of what happened in 27, to me, it was somehow more understandable what happened in 1957, and that while there's not a direct line to be drawn, I think you would find that the story of John Carter was much more alive in the black community than it was in the white community, that the oral tradition had passed that story down through the black community. So I do think there is some, that it has some importance for Little Rock's history that we shouldn't overlook. After 1957, there were, I think both the events of 57 and the events of 1927, the John Carter lynching, have underpinned some of the post-1957 issues that Little Rock was dealing with, whether it was urban renewal or the building of I-630. A lot of these initiatives that make up the city that we have today, I can't draw the line directly, but it seems like the history that we suffered earlier informed some of those decisions that were made. And created a lot of systemic division in the community. The key question of my book, which brings us to the present day, the key question that I wanted the book to explore was one that Ken Richardson said to me in an interview. And his question was, and he was a brilliant football star at Central, by the way, but he asked the question of me, and I think it's a question that we here in the community can ask, but also that the country needs to ask. And that's, are we really embracing each other, or are we just tolerating each other? So, and I think that a lot of what happened during the 2007, some of the infighting and some of the extreme positions that people took and were part of the process of doing what James Baldwin hoped we would do, which was examine history and discuss history, even if it's contentious. So in a lot of ways, I think that the 50th anniversary commemoration was because of all the discussion that was going on, did kind of put a right bracket on what had happened in the past and has allowed us to move forward. As far as the Central football team from 2007, they didn't live up to expectations, and there were a number of reasons for that. There was a dearth of leadership that the coaches had identified, and there were injuries, especially on the offensive line, was very, very thin. And they lacked the kind of tailback that Bernie Cox required to get, 3 yards on third down when he needed it. But to me, that was all sort of, not what I was interested in. What I saw happening on the field, and what I'll remember from the season and being in the coach's office, was the small moments that make up our days, and the small decisions that we make every day that end up accumulating and affecting the way we live. So there's the bantering in the coach's office, and the time a player apologized for some of his actions in front of the team. And finally, I'm going to read this passage and then I'll close it open for questions. was a speech Bernie Cox gave right before the Catholic game. And it was a very moving speech about his friend and mentor, Clyde Horton, who was one of the great Central graduates of all time, a football star in the late 40s or mid 40s, who came back to Central as a coach in 1960 and has pretty much coached continuously, either as a volunteer or as on staff from 1960 through 2007. 2007 was his last year as a volunteer assistant with the team. And he had suffered from a mysterious disease in the 90s that almost killed him. Finally he was taken to the Mayo Clinic and diagnosed, but it was a very rare condition that left him just a shell of himself for a couple of years until they diagnosed it and were able to treat it. And I wanted the two stories, the football team and the history of Little Rock and present day Little Rock politics and all, to just resonate with each other. I didn't want to draw direct lines or try and tie everything up, because I don't think that's how life works. But I do want to read this speech that Bernie Cox gave before the Catholic game, and you can decide whether it can apply to, the community at large. And here it is. Bernie's son, Brian Cox, had spent years searching for the names of all Tigers, and the letterman listed in his book about the century of Central football took up 17 pages, from an abbot in 1905, whose first name is lost to history, to Kenneth Zinni, who played on the 1957 undefeated national championship team. All 1,537 of them precursors to this team, all of them clad in black and old gold, just like Jared Green and Quentin Brown and Randy Rankin and Kalen Kellybrew. Cox began speaking again about another Tiger, Clyde Horton. If I get emotional, it's not because I'm such a great writer that I'm moving myself, but it's because Clyde Horton rode with me on every away game. He was my seatmate, and we got to be very, very close. So, and it's taking me back to that moment. But here's what Coach Cox said. He's one of the most fierce competitors that Central High has ever had, Cox continued. He went to Alabama to play football. He wasn't very big, but he was fierce. He wouldn't back down from anyone at any time. That's the reason I believe in my heart. I would sneak into the ICU when he was in the hospital with that disease he had. I wasn't supposed to be in there, only family could go in there. But I would sneak in there when the nurses weren't watching. If you could have seen Coach Horton when I saw him in the ICU. He paused and his eyes started to well. I said a prayer every time I saw him up there because I thought he was gone. But he made it. You know why he made it? I believe this with all my heart. He learned to compete against any and everyone as an athlete, as a young man. Whether you know it or not, he's still that way today, 79, 80 years old. That's something that's in you. That never leaves you. That's the kind of thing we're trying to instill in you, that spirit, that power. I've told kids for years, I love to see you grab each other. I love to see you grab someone's hand. I love to see you hug someone. That's not a show of weakness, that's a show of strength. That's a sharing of power and strength to me, sharing with your teammates and friends, those you respect and those you love. He couldn't say any more, and he bowed his head for the minute of silence they observed before every game. When he raised his head, he said, "Leave it out there now, let's go." The players began clapping and slapped each other on the shoulder pads and filed down the narrow hall to the steps leading out to the field, reaching up over the last doorway to touch the horseshoe that had been there for as long as anybody could remember, though nobody could remember who had put it there. On the field for warm-ups, Horton took his defensive linemen, as usual, under the south goal post and ran them through some basic contact drills. He was fierce, but he was not made of stone, and there were tears in his eyes from the locker room speech. His group told him they were going to win the game for him. "Win it for Bernie," he replied. "He needs it more than I do." Thank you.
All right, we have time for some questions. If you would wait until the microphone comes to your hand so we can hear you. So does anybody have any questions? Is that Jimmy Faulkner over there crying? Jay, let me start by asking this. In the John Carter thing in 1927, where was John Carter's family? What did they do? How did they respond? What happened? What was the aftermath of that? I mean, we know the story, but what happened to the survivors? I mean, somebody had to go home that night and say, your son, your brother, your father. What happened?
I'm not sure. I don't. He'd been on the penal farm for a misdemeanor, or not a misdemeanor, but an assault, a minor assault on a woman, and I think when there was a story that came out in the Arkansas Times several years ago. I don't remember exactly when, but it's in the bibliography. And in going through the files of the papers of the writer, who I believe was a senior at Hendrix, and it was his senior thesis, there was mention made that John Carter had a son in Little Rock who was still living at that time, but nobody ever followed up on it or found him, so I don't know what happened to his family.
Clark.
Jay, it came up numerous times in the book that Bernie Cox is this old kind of tough man, like you described him well, but he frequently said that it was, and he kind of touched on it in speech, he would say to his players, I want you to be able to say, I love you, and it's okay to love each other. And that's a tough lesson to get across to kids who are, 14, 15, 16 years old, in a high school. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, and also tied into that, you talked a little bit, there's still lingering, issues. Kids sitting white and black in the cafeteria. Do you think that lesson that it's okay to love each other is something that is easier found on the football field, or do you think it could be expanded to the broader school?
To answer the second question first, it's true there are still divisions at the school, and one of the players that I talked to, Damian Lee, who was a junior that year, I asked him about, why don't the black and white teammates hang out together, or why is the lunchroom, divided? And he said, I said, does the school not give you enough, opportunities? And he said, no, I put it on the students. We're just, somebody has to step up and cross those boundaries that are so ingrained. So I don't know that from what I saw at Central, there was a lot of the kind of nurturing that Bernie Cox showed, or that I show Bernie Cox doing in the book, among a lot of the coaching staff, among the teachers. I sat in on a few classes, so I think that support is there, and that's one reason why I think that Little Rock school districts white enrollment numbers are where they are, as opposed to, say, Memphis and Birmingham and Dallas, where whites really have abandoned the public school system. As far as the message of love, there was a party that I went to after before the Cabot game. It was all African American players, and they were making fun of that, that line. But they also kind of acknowledged its importance as well by kind of making fun of it, And I have to say too that those kids, they came from good parents who showed them a lot of love, and they were good kids. They were well behaved, churchgoers, and they took that their moral lives pretty seriously. So that was one of the surprising things for me, was that was how how nice the kids were, and I think that's attributable. Not, Bernie Cox reinforces that, but they get that at home.
Yes, sir, Garth.
Jay, of course, Central's had such an illustrious success in football in previous years. What do you attribute their recent lack of success to?
That's obviously the big question. I think it's, I'm going to dodge the question somewhat, but I will say that I think to generalize it, there's issues with big urban school districts and issues with small town school districts, and the Little Rock School District and its athletic programs, and a lot of them have had a downturn that we are not, as Little Rockians, are not used to experiencing. So I think in a community like Cabot, you've got a system, and when you see a kid in the 3rd grade, he's going to play your system, and you know who your players are going to be from the 3rd grade on, and that's no exaggeration. They start running that program at that time, and they may not be as talented as Central, but they're funneled into the system. So I think that's one thing. Also, I think that there is a sort of generational shift that happened very quickly in football, and it's Xbox and the NFL, the ubiquity of the NFL is responsible for it, because all the players that season, as well as other seasons, want to play like Peyton Manning and Tom Brady, and throw the ball 50 times a game, because that's more fun. And you combine that with 7-on-7, football's becoming all a year-round sport. So when you do have a coach like Bernie Cox, whose football is a little more conservative, I'll put it delicately that way, that you have kids who might not want to play that style, and they end up transferring. So I think that's part of it too. But I think also that to blame the system is not entirely true, because as recently as 2004, Central had a great team. They had a lot of talent, and showed that system could still work.
Yes, sir.
How much did Bernie Cox's religious faith play in his coaching, from your observation?
There was an underpinning there, but I also, what I noticed was that Bernie was very careful not to impose any of his beliefs on anybody else. I mean, part of that is a legal issue. But when, the players would sometimes gather themselves and say the Lord's Prayer or something after practice, and Bernie would always walk away, turn his back. He spoke more, or informed what he told the players more in terms of morality and wanting to do the right thing and behave correctly, and honor your parents, and sort of baseline values that are obviously part of the Christian tradition. But it was done more that way than through anything overt.
Yeah, Charlie.
If athletics is such a great laboratory for kids to broaden their education, race relations, personal relationships, and I agree with that, and I think you agree with that, then why is it in at least the Little Rock district that I'm familiar with, is it so hard for the athletic departments to get the support of the administration to fund programs to so that these kids, black and white, can experience that?
Well, it's the age-old question of funding, isn't it? You just, you know, I think there's something of a philosophy that those, and maybe this is rightly so, that the resources should go in the classroom, and that's where you educate kids. I think it's somewhat short-sighted to say we're going to cut the extracurricular programs, because the ones that are cut are often the ones where, you know, kids develop relationships with each other and learn to really get to know each other. So that's why you have, you know, people protesting about the, you know, dropping march programs that some, you know, bureaucrats might think are extraneous. So, you know, some people would think football is extraneous, but I happen to not be one of those.
Let me just say that very few authors from Arkansas have their books reviewed in the New York Times book review section. Even fewer authors from Arkansas get reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And when you look at his book appearances and the people that are interested in this book, you can see that it has a broader appeal than just football. It is about the soul of American City, and I think you've done a great job with it. I encourage people to come now and buy this book and let Jay sign Carry the Rock. Let's give a round of applause for Jay.